All right. Well, thank you, Andrew and Nicholas and Dan. And thank you, dear friends, for coming to this section conference and for your support of the section for the literary arts and humanities of the School for Spiritual Science. These are troubled times, and it has been very challenging to put this conference together. And I know it has been challenging for you to get here. But as Canadian poet and section member Philip Thatcher said, "It is times like these, Bruce, when an event like ours is perhaps even more necessary." And I hope he is right. I'll read a verse this morning to start our conference, and I'm going to use the same verse that I used last year. Since last year's conference, Celebrating the Mountain, and this year's conference, Return to the Mountain, have much in common. I'll use a fragment by Novalis that we find in a collection of jottings that Novalis called the General Stewpot. And this is one of his notebooks where all kinds of thoughts and odds and ends bubbled up and flavored one another. Here it is. The literary arts. Everything that a scholar does, says, speaks, suffers, and hears, etc., must be an artistic, technical, and scientific product, or some such operation. He speaks in epigrams. She acts in a play. He is a dialoguist. She lectures on treatises and sciences. He relates anecdotes, stories, fairy tales, novels. She perceives poetically. If he draws sometimes as an artist, sometimes as a musician. Her life is a novel, and that is why she sees, hears, and reads everything precisely in this manner. In short, the true scholar is the completely developed human being who bestows on whatever they touch and do a scientific, idealistic, and syncretistic form. And now for contrast and balance, and because we are meeting in San Francisco and calling this event Return to the Mountain, I will read a quote that I first encountered in my teens on a rainy night on Mount Marcy in New York State. It's a jotting by Gary Snyder, one of my poetry teachers, and it was written at Sourdough Mountain Lookout on January 19th, 1953. You can find it in this classic book, Earth Household. Here it is. Up at 5:45, wind blowing the mist through the trees and over the snow. Rinsed my face in the waterhole at the edge of the snowfield, ringed with white rock, and around that heather. Put up the SX aerial on a long pole made by some lookout of years past. Sticks and limbs and trunks, all wired and tied together. Made a shelf for papers out of half an old orange crate, and turned the radio receiver off. Walked down the ridge over the snow that follows so evenly the very crust snow on the north slope. Meadows and trees on the south. Small ponds lying in meadows just off the big snowfields. Snags, clumps of mountain hemlock, alpine fir, a small amount of Alaska cedar. So, my friends, we have a very full conference program for the next 3 days, from an encounter with Big Sur Coyote poet Jaime de Angulo to an inquiry into the question, who is Rudolf Steiner? To a celebration of an early romantic masterpiece, Hymns to the Night, by another Coyote poet, Novalis, to a questioning of beauty, truth, and goodness as presiding goddesses for our section work, and that also includes time on Mount Tamalpais, not to mention Bach, Bartok, Sheila Silver, and Sofia Gubaidulina, whose music started out our conference last night. And indeed, with all those themes, you might ask, where is the red thread that weaves us together? Well, as I said last year, I think we can all agree that we are individuals with an abiding enthusiasm for literature and poetry, and for the humanistic, life-affirming disciplines that nourish this enthusiasm. Many here today self-identify as poets, writers, and scholar meditants, lovers of language and words, and the spirit music of narratives. I think we all feel a deep connection to the mystery of poetic language and the literary imagination. And I would also wager that most of us, if not all of us, have had life-transforming, destiny experiences with poetry, with the creative word, and imaginative language, stories, fairy tales. Perhaps you are a writer, a poet, a novelist, or a scholar in the humanities. Perhaps as a reader or a listener, a certain poem or novel or a course in the humanities, these were peak experiences for you. Perhaps a certain story sang to you and struck you to the core very deeply and wounded you at just the right moment of your life and determined your destiny. Or maybe you are on a quest to magically transform your life into a meaningful story or novel or poem or fairy tale, as novelists like to say. You want to become a singer-poet and transform your life story through the alchemy of imagination, storytelling, and language. Well, that is the red thread that binds us together, I think, and it is what our section and this conference is all about, in my opinion. In the section meetings, I like to say that we are the shepherds of stories, and this conference is an attempt to speak about stories and the mystery of what is undeniably, for many persons, those who play with language and who shepherd stories, what is undeniably a spiritual, or dare I say, a deeply mystical event. Last September, I spoke about the uniqueness of the Pacific Rim and the challenges and opportunities that the Pacific Rim presents for someone in our section for the literary arts and humanities. It is not easy to do this dance. From a literary standpoint, it is very challenging to be a North American anthroposophist on the Pacific Rim. Aside from knowing what Rudolf Steiner wrote and said and did, and knowing about the history of the anthroposophical movement and its antecedents, you also need familiarity with the literature that influenced Rudolf Steiner. And I know I upset some people when I remind them that anthroposophy is a distinctly German affair, and that Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy is literature, and that it has its roots firmly planted in German literature, philosophy, world outlook, and aesthetics. That it roots itself very solidly in the time of Novalis, who is one of our red threads. But in addition to at least some familiarity with that distant literary ecology and how Rudolf Steiner did his walkabouts in that remarkable landscape, in addition to that, you also need, I think, and most importantly, you need to be a citizen of our globalized 21st century. And you need to have opened yourself to all the disparate and often contradictory literary and spiritual and cultural influences, past, present, and forthcoming, many of which on our Pacific Rim flow to us from Asia and elder times. And you need to open yourself to the many disparate influences that accord with the vibrant living spirit of our time. As I said last year, and I'll emphasize it again, Northern California, the Pacific Rim, the Ring of Fire, in an extended sense, is an ideal place for a 21st century anthroposophist, in my opinion. There are few places more diverse, more eclectic, more confusing and nuanced in the range of voices and poetic themes, and in conflict of traditions, old and new. The windows are wide open in many directions, north, south, east, and west. It is a vast landscape which, despite all attempts to silence it and pave it over, it still sings in the bones and whispers in the soul. It's a place that has always attracted literary pioneers from all parts of this continent and the world. Many of those wanderers were eccentrics, oddballs, or what we Californians call disruptors. And when they got here, they often felt they had pushed as far as they could go. They were transformative and often annoying. And this ring of fire was for them a kind of alchemical crucible in a literary sense. And keep in mind, my friends, that the pen name, Novalis, means pioneer. Novalis is a pen name, and it means a person who takes initiative, a liminal person, a person who oversteps boundaries, who trespasses, who strikes off into landscapes nobody really wants to explore, or maybe into places they have been told to ignore. So, understood in such a way, my friends, there are many Novalises in this sanctuary this morning, are there not? You are all Novalises. Now, as you know, Rudolf Steiner placed great emphasis on Novalis, the herald of anthroposophy. He pointed to Novalis in his last address, and he suggested that Novalis would be very important for our 21st century. Well, here we are, 25 years into that century. Why did Rudolf Steiner talk about Novalis as much as he did? Well, personally, I think it has a lot to do with magical idealism. And that's another red thread that I'd like to talk about this morning. We could approach Novalis and magical idealism in many ways: philosophical, biographical, literary critical. We could put on our university hats and take magical idealism into the seminar room and pull it apart, and that would be fun. But this morning, instead of doing that, I want to talk about magical idealism by entering the world of fairy tale, aka old-time stories. And that is how Novalis came to an understanding of the term. The word that Novalis uses in German for fairy tale is Märchen. And this is a word that does not translate well into the English notion fairy tale, which comes to us burdened with all kinds of sentimental, kitschy, and often patronizing connotations that we inherit from 19th century reading publics. Readers who like to treat fairy tales as literary pastries or moral parables for simple-minded children or daydreamy adults. But you know as well as I do, Novalis did not understand the term fairy tale that way, nor did Rudolf Steiner. Novalis placed a great deal of importance on fairy tales as portals to magical idealism and poetry, and he saw the fairy tale as the highest form of literary art. Let me repeat that. He saw fairy tale as the highest form of literary art. Now, if you think about that statement, it really is kind of shocking. Much of what Novalis says about the spiritual importance of fairy tale is echoed by Rudolf Steiner 100 years after the death of Novalis. Rudolf Steiner builds upon the insights of Novalis. Here is one important representative quote from Rudolf Steiner, which echoes Novalis, and indeed it might be Novalis speaking. Quote, "There is a great difference in whether one has, as a child, grown up with fairy tales. The soul-stirring nature of fairy tale pictures becomes evident only later. If fairy tales have not been given, this shows itself in later years in weariness for life. Indeed, it even comes to expression physically. Fairy tales can help counter illnesses. What is absorbed little by means of fairy tales emerges subsequently as joy in life, in the meaning of life. It comes to light in the ability to cope with life even into old age. Children must experience the power inherent in fairy tales while they are young, when they can still do so. Whoever is not capable of living with ideas that have no reality for the physical plane dies for the spiritual world." Now, those are very strong words from Rudolf Steiner, are they not? And if you are a parent or grandparent like me, well, they might make you run into the bedroom to read a fairy tale to your youngster. But wait a minute. One of the most liberating insights of Novalis and or Rudolf Steiner is that the fairy tale is not just for children. Every adult needs to hear a true fairy tale. We hear so many bad and mangled fairy tales these days, do we not? We wallow in them. But every adult has an angel child inside or on the shoulders, an angel child who needs to hear a true fairy tale in the right way. But maybe the adult does not allow the angel child to hear such stories. Maybe the adult would rather explain the deep hidden meaning of childish fairy tales and say wise things and teach lessons about the psyche or about the spirit or about the deeper meanings hidden behind silly words. Take a moment right now to check in with your angel child. And I'm talking about that angel child daemon that's always on your shoulder. How's that angel child feeling these days? Is the angel child happy, sad, frightened, worried, angry, sick? Is it in a bad mood? Does it have the ha-has? Is the angel child afraid of the world and terrified because all it hears is frightening stories about doomsday or conspiracy theories? Take a moment, and while you do that, I'll share another quote. This is one more bit of wisdom that Rudolf Steiner received from his mentor, and that was a professor of literature who set the course for Rudolf Steiner's life. Here's the quote. Fairy tales and sagas are comparable to a good angel, granted human beings as a companion from birth on their life's wanderings, to be a trustworthy comrade throughout, offering comradeship and making life into a truly ensouled fairy tale. I just want to linger for a moment on that phrase, life as a truly ensouled fairy tale. There is, I think, hardly a better definition of magical idealism. Now, in the old days, when I talked about magical idealism, I always put on my impressive scholarly hat and my cloak and took out my PhD from the University of California, and I talked about highfalutin German philosophy. Now, I did this because Novalis took that approach in his life. He studied Fichte and Kant and German idealist philosophy quite intensely, even obsessively, you might say. But when Novalis became Novalis, he stopped chewing on philosophy and he said, well, now I'm finished with it. I have left philosophy on the bookshelves. May she rest in peace. What did he mean? Well, for one thing, he meant that he had gone as far on the trail called philosophy that the trail could take him. And when the trail petered out in a dark forest and he found himself without a map, he became a poet, and he began to say that the fairy tale was the highest form of literature. Now, before we get all excited and put on our literary critical debating shorts, let's look at what Novalis meant by poet. It's a rather special meaning, but it's rather ordinary at the same time. For Novalis, a poet is not someone who writes clever verses or publishes poems in literary magazines or teaches creative writing. No, poet for Novalis means what we are all presumably striving to become by virtue of our being here now as human beings. That is, free and ethical, spiritually awake individuals, persons who are creatively active and lovingly imaginative, hopelessly, hopefully embodied and intertwined with a mad, mad, crazy world. For Novalis, we are all of us poets intrinsically. It is a feature of our human beingness, whether we know it or not. And maybe we don't know it. Maybe we don't believe it. The place where Novalis most clearly develops his ideas about poetry or magical idealism is in the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen. And here is a quote from that novel that I think will help us this morning a little bit. I read it last year. These are words spoken to young Heinrich by the master poet Klingsor. "It is really quite unfortunate," said Klingsor, "that poetry has a highbrow reputation, and that poets are set apart as special types. There is nothing so very mysterious about it. Poetry happens as a natural function of the human mind. Does not every human being strive and poeticize at every moment?" Now let me repeat that last sentence again. Does not every human being strive and poeticize at every moment? Novalis, through his mouthpiece, Klingsor, is telling us that to become magical idealists or poets, we must exercise our innately poetic human skills. We all have that potential and capacity. It is baked into our human beingness, Novalis tells us. We have it, but do we know it? For Novalis, we're all of us doing poetry all the time, for better or worse. There is nothing so very mysterious about it. Poetry happens as a natural function of the human mind. Does not every human being strive and poeticize at every moment? Good poetry, bad poetry. Fairy tales that heal us. Fairy tales that make us sick. The fairy tale Hyacinth and Rosebud is a helpful example for us today, and I'll share it with you and close with it. I think it's a good way to wind ourselves into our conference. And it's a fairy tale that the Section Fairy Tale group has studied and performed. That's the group that my wife Marion facilitates. And you can find the section performance of Hyacinth and Rosebud on YouTube or the section website. The fairy tale Hyacinth and Rosebud is found almost right in the middle of the novel The Apprentices at Sais. And this is a book filled with brainy insights and conversations about nature and the relationship of the human being to nature, and about what it all means. And the insights and conversations, they're a little bit like what you'd overhear at a prestigious Ivy League. That is why the fairy tale Hyacinth and Rosebud begins with the words, "Poor child who has not yet loved. With the first kiss, a new world opens to you, and with it life enters your enraptured heart in manifold radiance. I want to tell you a fairy tale. Listen." The hero of the fairy tale, Hyacinth, is a good illustration of our problem. Hyacinth is melancholic. He worries about this little nothing and that little nothing, Novalis says. But of course, those little nothings, they appear quite big to him. And they always do, don't they? In fact, they seem overwhelming. And so, when a mysterious stranger, a grand master of occult lore and esoteric wisdom and deep insights, arrives in town, well, Hyacinth immediately is besotted and fascinated. "Tell me the deep secrets of creation, master. Give me the key to all mythologies. I am unworthy. Teach me. I need your help." So, naturally, the mysterious stranger takes Hyacinth under his wing and initiates him into all sorts of occult lore. He even gives the young man a special book. It is the most special book ever written. It is so special and so deeply cool and wise, and it contains such incredible secrets about creation and the human being that, well, no human being can read it, Novalis says. But of course, Hyacinth is head over heels. He spends all his time with the teacher, and they go on long walks, and they have deep conversations long into the night. But at the same time, Hyacinth becomes more and more miserable. In fact, he becomes so miserable that he loses all interest in life. He becomes a sourpuss, and he turns his back on his sweetheart Rosebud and on his loving parents, and he suffers, and he grows depressed, and becomes more and more estranged from the world, which he doesn't like. Then Novalis tells us, in a stroke of good luck, merit, or happy karma, Hyacinth meets an old woman in the forest who says, "Ha! Show me that stranger's special book." So Hyacinth shows it to her. And what does the old woman do? She burns the book. Right there in front of him. She burns the book. "Oh, no!" cries Hyacinth. But the old woman, Novalis tells us, gives Hyacinth a good dose of enlightenment right on the spot, and the lad is changed forever. In other words, she frees Hyacinth for his individual, magical idealist quest. But of course, Hyacinth goes from one extreme to the other. He's young, and you know we do bang around. Hyacinth runs home, and he tells his devoted parents he is leaving. He tells his devoted girlfriend, Rosebud, "I'm leaving, adios." So you see, although he is freed from the glamour of the stranger's book, which he thought he could substitute for lived experience, he is still in delusion about many things, and most of all about himself. But that is the nature of enlightenment, is it not? It zigs and it zags. Just when you think you have it figured out, oh no, criminy, back to the beginning, back to once upon a time. Hyacinth leaves home and begins a quest for the mother, the goddess Isis, Novalis tells us, the veiled goddess who guards the true secret, the open secret of life and nature and human being. He wanders about the so-called wilderness like a Parzival, if you know that tale. Hyacinth's most important moments of learning and initiation occur when he keeps quiet and listens and remains all alone with himself in nature. During those special moments of stillness and silence, he sits down and shuts up. He is not like Faust in that regard, by the way. Faust hardly ever sits down and shuts up. Faust is always restless. He bangs about. In fact, he must bang about. That's what his pact with the devil means. If Faust were to make the inward turn and sit down and keep quiet, the devil's got him. But hey, no big deal. Any beginner who tries to meditate has that experience in no time flat. First half hour on the cushion or less. The point is this: Hyacinth is not a Faust, Hyacinth does learn to sit down and keep quiet, and when he does, he gradually finds that deep primordial still point of the questioning that guides the quest, which writes the story. In other words, he becomes like the Dumpkin character in the fairy tales, the stupid third brother or sister, the one whose prospects look very unpromising. He listens to flowers. He talks to birds and clouds. He hovers attentively with the universe, such as it is. He learns to sit and breathe and pay attention to the inner world that is the outer world, and to the outer world that is the inner world. He learns the art of boredom, as I like to say. And then, like a Parsifal dropping the reins of his horse, and allowing the horse to find its way without interference over a long period of time, Hyacinth slowly becomes quiet enough and receptive enough and childlike wise enough to listen his way to the Grail. In this case, the Grail is the veiled goddess Isis, Novalis tells us. Hyacinth arrives at the still point of the turning wheel. And what does he discover? Well, I hope I have piqued your curiosity and that you will take the next step of Hyacinth's journey on your own. And since you are all poets, you can finish this fairy tale yourselves. Novalis had confidence that we could all become poets or magical idealists because we are all poets already. We always already have been. It's baked into the iOS, as they say down the 101. Novalis had confidence that we could wake up to our human spirit reality as poets, and that if we did wake up, we would discover that the spiritual world is in fact already open to us. It is always open. If we were to become suddenly so flexible to perceive it, we would perceive ourselves in the midst of the spiritual world. So maybe that is one reason Rudolf Steiner emphasized Novalis as much as he did, even with his dying words. But he left us on our own to figure out what he meant. I must confess that when I was younger, I worried about this a lot. My friends, for a long time I could not connect with Novalis. Novalis was just a name on a page. I had to go searching for Novalis, like the hero in the fairy tale Hyacinth and Rosebud. I had to go on my own solo, foolish coyote walkabout. But the way to connect with Novalis is right there spelled out for us in the fairy tale Hyacinth and Rosebud that I presented this morning. And it raises an interesting question that I will pose for you as I close this talk. Can one be inspired by anthroposophia without being a student of Rudolf Steiner? Does Rudolf Steiner equal anthroposophia? Is Rudolf Steiner our only point of access to anthroposophia? Or is Rudolf Steiner one voice and one viewpoint in a greater, more encompassing wisdom tradition, variously known, variously explored, variously beckoning and singing in various ways, and in a certain embodied, poetic, magical idealist sense, always already present and at hand? I'll close this morning's welcome with another fragment by the poet Novalis. Here it is in this book that I prepared for our conference and for tonight's performance of Hymns to the Night. This is a fragment from one of the Novalis notebooks called the Fichte Studies. And this is a notebook that Novalis kept during the time he was courting Sophie. He had not yet named himself Novalis. He thought he was just a Fritz. And like a young hyacinth, Fritz was fascinated with philosophy. But as you can hear in this fragment, young Fritz, or Hyacinth, had already begun to intuit his identity as a poet. And soon he reached the end point of philosophy, which he found when Sophie died. We'll explore that moment of arrival this evening when Emanuel Vukovic and I perform Hymns to the Night. But for now, shortly after Fritz wrote this fragment that I'm going to read to you to close, Hardenberg became Novalis. He became what he always was and would become, a poet. And when he understood his always already present poetic human beingness, then he began to say that the fairy tale was mightier than philosophy, and he began to explore what I like to call the last unknown country. He had found the unmapped land. Here's the fragment in my translation, and as I read it, think about Rudolf Steiner and Rudolf Steiner's explorations as a novalis of the unmapped land. What do I do when I philosophize? I speculate homeward. All philosophy ends in this place of beginning. When this place is not found, for it always already eludes us, then the need to philosophize becomes a call to endless activity. This eternal longing that leads me homeward cannot be satisfied in the context of my present earthly existence. Its goal can only be approximated endlessly. But therein lies my freedom. Thank you for your attention and for your interest in Romanticism and for your interest in the section for the literary arts and humanities. Good night.